Thanks, Ken. Welcome, everyone, to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm the President and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. My name is Warren Doctor. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's with support from people like you that let us have these programs. If you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, please join. I'm contractually obligated to say that. Just to let you know about some of the upcoming events before I turn over to our speakers, on May 15th, I don't know if you've noticed, we have a feature exhibition on the history of baseball in Tennessee called Home Runs and Home Teams. And one of the expert researchers that helped us put that exhibition together, because it's all original research, his name is Dean Novelli. And Dean Novelli will be discussing women's role in it. And the name of his talk, which will be May 15th at noon here for our brown bag, is Girls Can't Play Baseball, Tennessee Women in All-American Girl Professional Baseball League, which I think is really remarkable. There's a lot about that I didn't know about women's role in baseball until we put the exhibition out. On May 20th, we have another talk in the evening at 6 o'clock. Elaine Weiss will be discussing, or her talk is called Spell Freedom, the Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm sure it features the Highlander Center, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have our own Awards of Excellence on May 31st. We have a genealogy workshop on June 7th. And our upcoming downtown home tour is on June 14th. And we are looking for volunteers if you're interested in architecture or but now I'll turn over to our speakers this evening. I'm very excited because it's not often at the History Center we get children authors. And so it's fantastic to explore this and to see how Shannon Hitchcock has been able to keep Wilma Dykeman's legacy alive. And so I just want to introduce them both. Shannon Hitchcock is the author of several books for children and young readers, including her storyteller series, Saving Granddaddy's Stories, which is about Ray Hicks. She Sang for the Mountains, which is about Jean Ritchie, and The Story of Quilts, and now Words of Water, which is what they're discussing this evening. She lives in western North Carolina, and she can see the mountains every day from there. And Jim Stokely will also be here this evening. He has been writing for the National Park Service for 25 years as a human resources consultant, and he's the director of the National Endowment for Humanities project called An Appalachian Experience. He serves as the president and treasurer of the Wilma Dykeman Legacy and has written numerous edited books. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to our speakers. If you guys want to come up, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
We're going to be talking about Wilma Dykeman and bringing her life and her words to a new generation. I'm the author of the 9 books you see on screen. The 5 on the top are middle grade novels. And I define a middle grade novel as a story that anybody can enjoy. But you can hand it to an upper elementary school student or a middle schooler because there's no sex, no bad language. The 4 books on the bottom are part of my Storyteller series, and those books are illustrated, and we're really going to focus on Wilma. So here you have the Storyteller series. I need a little sip of water. The first book is Saving Granddaddy's Stories, Ray Hicks, the Voice of Appalachia. Ray was an oral storyteller. And what that means is he didn't read them out of a book. He didn't write them down. Instead, Ray just engaged with his audience. And his claim to fame is the International Storytelling Festival there in Jonesboro. And then she sang for the mountains, the story of Jean Ritchie, singer, songwriter, activist. Jean was from the Cumberland Mountains of Kentucky. And I always tell people that a ballad is really just a story that has been set to music. And then Story Quilts. That book's a little different. because it does not focus on a particular person. It's about all of the women in Appalachia that have shared their stories through quilts. And then we have the woman of the hour, Wilma Dykeman. Wilma wrote her stories. She was an actual Appalachian author. How I discovered Wilma. I had never heard of this woman before. I grew up in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a little town called East Bend, North Carolina. Never heard of Wilma. I moved to Asheville. I was already writing for kids. I had the 3 books in the Storyteller series. I was looking for an Appalachian author, but I didn't know who I wanted to write about. I happened to be in the special collections room at the Pike Memorial Library, which is downtown Asheville. There was a big 3-panel cardboard display, and it told the story of Wilma Dykeman. In front of that display was a desk, and on the desk was an old typewriter and a hat with flowers, because Wilma was known for wearing hats. And there was also a picture of Wilma doing a book signing. So whenever I looked at those things and I read the display, I thought, well, maybe Wilma is the Appalachian author that I have been looking for. Then I was in the Battery Park Book Exchange and Champagne Bar, also downtown Asheville. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a wonderful used bookstore, but you can also get a glass of wine or a glass of champagne there. And I was browsing through the used books. There was an entire shelf of books by Wilma Dykeman, right underneath the shelf of books by Thomas Wolfe. Well, used books are relatively inexpensive, so I just cleared out the shelf, and I took those home with me, and I started to read books by Wilma Dykeman. About that time, there was an article in the Citizen Times about, you guessed it, Wilma Dykeman. And that article was talking about Wilma's stance on civil rights and a book she wrote called Neither Black Nor White. And so about that time, I said, Wilma is auditioning for a part in my series. This woman is everywhere. And then I found out that Wilma had actually wanted to be an actress. And at that point, I was sure she was auditioning. What drew me to Wilma is she really was a woman ahead of her time. It doesn't matter if you're talking about birth control, if you're talking about cleaning up the river, if you're talking about civil rights. Back in the 1950s, before these things were really mainstream conversations, Wilma already had these things on her mind. She was already writing about them. When I talk to school children, I tell them that Wilma was a busy lady. And, she had all these accomplishments, and she had them while raising a family. She wrote a nonfiction book called The French Broad, which, to my mind, is one of her biggest accomplishments. She wrote a weekly newspaper column for the Knoxville News Sentinel. She wrote the book Neither Black Nor White about civil rights that won the Sidney Hillman Award. She was a novelist with her books being set in Appalachia. And she taught creative writing and Appalachian literature at the University of Tennessee. She was the first female trustee at Berea College, and keep that in mind, I'm going to say a little bit more about Wilma and Berea later on. And she was the official state historian of Tennessee for 20 years. What made it a pleasure to write about Wilma is primary sources. I didn't have to wonder about anything. I didn't have to make anything up. I didn't even have to exaggerate. Wilma left a treasure trove. In the book, Family of Earth, that book was just in a manuscript form, and then after Wilma died, her son Jim and his brother Dykeman found this manuscript, and it was published by the University of North Carolina Press. But in that book, Wilma told me about her childhood. And I was able to see the things in her childhood that made her grow up to be an environmental writer. And then all of those newspaper columns, they were collected into books of essays. And so Wilma told me what she thought about almost everything. It was like having personal conversations with her. I read about her going to concentration camp in Europe. I read about how she felt about being a mom. I read how she felt about taking care of the river. When I write these books, they have a set format. They are 32 pages long. And I cannot fill those pages up with words because I have to leave room for the illustrator to draw. And so because of that, I'm looking for a theme. I'm looking for something that I can pull from their childhood all the way through their life. And in Wilma's case, when I read the book, The French Broad, I was pretty sure that the theme of her life was water. Because I do school visits, it's really important that my work is factually correct. So when this was in manuscript form, I met with Jim and I had him read it and let me know if I had made any mistakes. And one thing that he said was, in the author's note, I would like for you to include that Wilma was on the board of directors at Berea College. He said that was very important to her and that she was instrumental in making sure it did not turn into a legacy school, and instead that it stayed true to its mission to help people who were the first generation in their families to go to college. The illustrator for my series is Sophie Page. She illustrated all 4 books. Sophie is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, and she's a multimedia illustrator. And she crafts her images out of paper, clay, fabric, and wire. So I want to show you some of Sophie's artwork. She sent these along since she couldn't be here tonight. For the cover art, she had a black and white photograph of Wilma, and she drew her many, many times until she felt she had it just right for the cover. For the opening spread, Sophie started with a loose sketch. She usually does start with a loose sketch. And then she made the hands and the face out of clay. And then the clothing is out of cut paper. And then she painted the cut paper. And then finally she adds the details like the background of the mountains and the eyes and the cheeks. In this particular one, Sophie started with a sketch, but she actually made a train out of clay. And then you can see what it looks like when she painted and added the art, the background art. This is a picture of Wilma at a book signing. And it's from an actual photograph of Wilma at a book signing. It's actually the one that I saw in Pack Memorial Library. And so you can see what it looked like in loose sketch form and then Sophie's final artwork. This is a wilderness landscape from the book, and Sophie made the river and she made the mountains out of cut paper. And then you can see at the bottom where she added hunters and hikers and fishermen and a little cabin. Part of my job is to engage young readers. And because Wilma was on the board of directors at Berea College, I was invited to Berea to do one of my launch events. And so I was there at the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center. And there's a little park in town and it has a story trail. I don't know if you're familiar with story trails, but there are stations. This is the first station that said, welcome to the Berea Story Trail. But if you walked along the path at each station and stopped and read it, you would have read my entire book by the time you got to the end of the story trail. One thing that was really thrilling for me was that the National Science Teaching Association named Of Words and Water an outstanding science trade book. It was one of 25 books that they honored last year. And why that's so important to me is because I can bring Wilma's story to Eastern Tennessee. I can bring it to Western North Carolina. But when things like this happen, it gives it some national exposure. All right, let's read the book, and then it's not very long, so don't get concerned. And then at the end, Jim and I are going to be in conversation, and if you have any questions, then we can answer those. Born in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the French Broad River, Wilma Dykeman was an only child. Her first words were, "Water coming down." With no brothers or sisters, Wilma's companions were flowering dogwoods, twinkling fireflies, tumbling streams. In nature, she never felt alone. On fresh spring mornings, Wilma studied frog eggs in the pond. Each day she watched and waited as the black specks grew larger and larger, finally hatching into tadpoles. On endless summer days, Wilma waded in the creek. She spotted crayfish crawling from under rocks and lizards slithering among the leaves. See, the seeds for Wilma becoming an environmental writer were sown in her childhood. On brisk autumn evenings, Wilma and her parents took long wooded walks. They taught her the names of trees: poplar, black walnut, maple, and oak. She discovered the water cycle, a path water follows as it moves around the earth. As fall faded into winter, Wilma's mother read aloud before the blazing fire. She read of countries far across the ocean and of times long ago. Wilma grew to love history and the sound of words. When Wilma was 14, she watched a train leave the station carrying her father away for burial. She knew her life would never be the same. Wilma's mother couldn't afford to send her away for college, but Wilma wanted to learn and see the world. She earned a scholarship to pay for school, then waved goodbye to her mountains and her beloved river. After graduation, a friend introduced Wilma to James Stokely. She thought his eyes were as clear blue as the sky. James asked if Wilma liked books, woods, and Beethoven. She believed they were destined to be together. As husband and wife, they built a stone cottage in the Smoky Mountains. Living in misty, cloud-kissed mountains, Wilma longed to write a book about the river she loved. James became her research partner. Together they journeyed along the French River collecting stories from local families. Wilma's book highlighted trouble long hidden in the mountain's shadow, companies and towns that dumped their waste in the river. She wrote of black water, dying trout, anxious people who feared the expense of cleaning the river would cost them their jobs. A New York publisher agreed to buy the book, but only if Wilma ignored the poison being dumped in the river. The girl who had splashed in the pond, waded in the creek, and who cherished the river refused to back down. Wilma wanted to shine a bright light on water pollution. She hoped to inspire people, towns, businesses, everyone to help clean up the river. Wilma wrote that a clean river would bring new businesses. A clean river would bring visitors. A clean river would bring enjoyment to families, fishermen, hunters, and hikers. Wilma argued, we can have factories and we can have towns and we can have clean water. Wilma's words seeped into her publisher's thoughts just as water seeps into the soil. They printed the French Broad Wilma's Way, bringing river contamination to the nation's attention. Change happened slowly, but a steady stream of words flowed from Wilma's pen. A weekly newspaper column, novels and biographies, speeches that educated and inspired. Wilma's messages were as constant as rivers rolling toward the sea. Be good to the earth, fair to other people. Use words to fight injustice. Wilma lived a long, full life, and in the starkness of winter said her final goodbyes. Her grave can be found in the Blue Ridge Mountains where she was born, near the river she helped save. To this day, tourists stroll along the Wilma Dykeman Riverway, a path that winds between the French Broad and Swananoa rivers, a path inspired by a woman who wrote, "Water is the irreplaceable gift. It is life. use, cherish, celebrate, preserve, enjoy. The book ends with an author's note, which is really for educators or parents that read the story and want to know a little bit more about Wilma Dykeman. I won't bore you by reading it, but I will tell you that the most important sentence in there is that if you want to know even more, go to wilmadykemanlegacy.org. That is an organization that Jim runs, and he is the perfect person to tell you more about it when we have our question and answers. So now Jim and I are going to be in conversation together.
Shannon, that was great. You're a good public speaker, clear. You don't say, So I've got a half dozen questions, and I'm not going to fire them at her. I'm just going to take my time. But, and I said, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your growing up years. Every time I meet somebody, I want to know where they grew up.
I grew up in East Bend, North Carolina, which is about 30 miles west of Winston-Salem. I grew up on a farm, a 100-acre farm. My grandpa was a tobacco farmer, and we grew up very primitive compared to what kids live like today. I always tell them that, my grandmother had a big vegetable garden, and she canned most of what we ate. And that if we wanted chicken for Sunday dinner, my grandmother wrung its neck. And my grandpa, milked the cows every morning, and grandma strained the milk. I don't think I'd ever had milk out of a carton until I went to school. We always just had gallons of milk. And so I grew up very primitively. I grew up outside. I grew up, manning the tobacco stringer. And then when I got big enough, putting the tobacco on the stringer. I didn't think I grew up all that different until my husband and I moved to New Jersey. We were working for AT&T, and they closed the facility in Winston-Salem, and we had a job transfer, both of us. And I got there and I thought, Dorothy, you're not in Kansas anymore.
Well, so the family was close. You had a close family. And it was not just the nuclear family, is that right?
My dad was one of 6 sons, and when each boy got married, my grandpa gave him an acre of land to build a house. So I could walk to my grandparents' house and to my 5 uncles, aunts, and 13 cousins. So we all really grew up kind of like a clan. And I always said I didn't need a lot of friends because I had a lot of family.
And what was your maiden name?
My maiden name was Williams.
Williams. So you moved to New Jersey, was that it? That's the way you broke away from the family? I mean, a close-knit family like that, believe me, I'm talking from personal experience. It's also a binding family, and you have to strike a balance between being close-knit and a little bit perforated. And the question is, was that it? I mean, was it easy as driving 1,000 miles up to?
No, it was really hard whenever, nobody in my family had left. Everybody lived right there. But my husband and I we were both going to lose our jobs because they were closing down. And we had made the decision we were going to go. And I had not told my parents yet, and he wanted to go with me, and I said, no, you can't go. Trust me, you can't go. And so I went, and both my parents were crying, and I remember my father saying, I told you not to marry that Yankee. And the first time that my grandpa met David, he said, where are you from? And David said, Hickory, North Carolina. And my grandpa said, where's your grandpa from? And he said, Pennsylvania. And he said, yep, you're a Yankee.
So how'd you get back to North Carolina, and how did you get into children's literature?
Well, those are two really separate things. So I got back to North Carolina, but it took a lot of years. We lived and worked in New Jersey, and then in Massachusetts, and then in Omaha, Nebraska, and then in Atlanta, and we went back to New Jersey, and back to Atlanta, and back to New Jersey, and then to Tampa, Florida. But anyway, we ended up, back in North Carolina, and largely because both our moms are still alive, and we just felt like we wanted to be closer to home and to them. As for how I got into writing for children, I was somebody who always loved reading and writing. And I probably should have majored in something related in college. But I was the first generation in my family to ever go away to school. And I felt like I needed a degree in something practical and that I needed to be able to come out and make money because my parents weren't all that keen on a girl leaving home and living in her own apartment and all that stuff anyway. And my father actually said to me the first time, this is when I used to send grades to your parents, that the first time he got bad grades, I'd be coming home. And so I was scared to death not to study and make good grades. I knew that I would be going home. So, where was I going with that?
Children's literature.
Okay, so anyway, I majored in accounting. And I worked in accounting for AT&T. So, whenever I had my son, one day he gets off the school bus, and I can tell that something had gone very wrong with his day. And as soon as we got to the house, the tears started, and he was in first grade, and I said, "What is wrong?" And he said, "We are writing books in first grade, and I'm the only kid that nobody dedicated a book to." And I said, "Well, Alex, it's not personal, it's that they don't know you yet. We just moved." And I said, "All these kids went to kindergarten together, and you just got here, they don't know you." And he said, "Well, it still hurt my feelings." And I said, "Well, I'm going to write a real book, and I'm going to dedicate it to you." Well, I had no idea what I had just promised him. Because the thing is, we can all write. We're taught to write in school, but we don't know how to write for publication. You have to learn how to write for publication. And I didn't know the rules, and I didn't know the players, and I didn't know the first thing about what I had just promised him. And so I bought myself a market guide, and I wrote these little stories, and I sent them off, and I didn't hear a blessed thing from those people in New York. And I just did not understand why, and I kept sending them stories, and I kept not getting an answer. So about that time, I read an advertisement for the Institute of Children's Literature. I thought, maybe I need to back up, and I need to take a couple of classes and figure out what I'm doing wrong. Well, when I started taking classes, I figured out I was doing everything wrong. And so anyway, I took 3 classes, and they encouraged me to start writing for children's magazines, because they said the thing is, children's magazines are looking for content every month. Like if you take a highlights for children, they are publishing loads of stories, and they don't have to take much of a chance on you. Whereas to put a book like this out is going to cost a publisher $40,000. And so they need to feel like they can recoup that investment and actually make money. And there's a lot of people doing it that are really good at it, and so they're not especially looking to help you break in. So I started writing for children's magazines, and my first publication credit was for Highlights for Children, and it was a little story called My Sister Snores. And so I started writing for children's magazines, and then I joined the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And through them, I started going to their conferences, and I started meeting, because it's like everything else, you need to network, you need to smooze, you need to know people. And I started meeting agents and editors, and I kept writing. And you can, at those conferences, for $40, $50, you can pay for a professional critique. So I took my little stories and I paid people to tell me what was wrong with them. And I continued to work on them. And finally, after many years, I don't even know how many, I finally got good enough that somebody started to publish me.
That's a good answer. Anybody here ever tried their hand at writing picture book, chapter book? You want to give us a one-on-one tutorial on the, what is it, three major types of children's book?
There are three types. The first is an illustrated book called a picture book. There are multiple kinds of picture books. These are nonfiction. There are also, fictional picture books. Then there are middle grade novels, which I also write. And those are novels that are geared for upper elementary and middle school students. And then there is young adult. And in young adult, you are more looking at, probably later middle school, but high school. Generally, once you veer off of the student being too old for high school, you're looking at adult literature.
So, three more questions. Talk about engaging the younger generation with these notions of environmental literacy, environmental justice. Those are complicated notions. So how do you, first of all, do you engage the younger generation? And second of all, how do you engage them?
Well, I engage them through stories. So, when I read to them about Wilma Dykeman, and then we talk about Wilma's childhood, and that she was outside and playing in a creek and watching frog eggs. We talk about nature, and then we talk about, the need to take care of nature. And for my last couple of school visits, we've talked about how we now need to clean the river up again because of the hurricane. Because that impacted all of the kids that I've been talking to recently. And so I just tell them that it's a problem that's never going to go away, that, we're always going to have to make a commitment to take care of the river.
Yeah, I can live just outside of Asheville. I drove down this afternoon along the French Broad, and it's just a muddy river. What does Fort Loudon Lake look like? Here, is it mud? Is it muddy? Is it brown? It's not brown. Steve shaking his head.
Well, it was really muddy for a long time after the hurricane.
But now,
It's greeny.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's full.
Yeah.
Are you making any school visits?
I'm making a fair amount. I had 3 school visits in March, and I had, I think, 2 in April. So I don't want to do them full-time because then that leaves no time to write, but I do try to do several a year.
And what, in your opinion, this will be the last of kind of the structured questions that we open it up for discussion. What do we as individuals, as groups, as industries need to do to inspire more people? What's the key to inspiring people to embrace the importance of environmental, just understanding how important the environment is to us?
Well, I just think it's stories, and that I've been doing some research into George Massa and Horace Kephart. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but a large reason we have the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was because of people like that, Horace's writing and George's pictures, and people who are just committed. And so I just say, whatever it is, we all have a talent of some kind. That whatever talent you've got, if you just use it toward good, use it toward helping take taking care of the environment, that if everybody just does a little something.
All right. That's all I got. Shannon, I'm sure you have a lot more. Let's open it up. Anybody got any comments, questions, thoughts? Angry tirades? Yeah, Natalie.
So what are you working on right now?
A book about George Massa. Yeah, I've been reading about George and Horace, so that's where that comment came from. And it would be an illustrated book, and hopefully, if I think I have some interest from a publisher. I'm pretty sure I do. I'm hopeful that we would get to use some of the actual photographs in addition to the artwork. But a lot of that is not in my control. When you sell your works to a publisher, they hire the illustrator, and the illustrator works with an art director. And so I can leave illustrator notes in the manuscript, but they don't have to follow them. But I leave them because they're my research notes. So I'm trying to save them some time. And, like when I was writing this book about Wilma, I put in the note that her father used a long wooded walking stick, and that the rug that she would have laid on was a Navajo rug. And so if I ran across those kinds of things when I'm doing my research, I make an illustrator note just to save them some time. But I really don't have a whole lot to say about the artwork.
So in Western North Carolina, George Massa was the influential photographer. There were other Tennessee side photographers. Thompson comes to mind, and there was a fellow who ran a lodge, Andy somebody, don't remember his last name, but there were people working in from the Tennessee side too. Shannon, Steve.
So George Massa was kind of a mysterious character, and Horace too, for that matter. But have you discovered any more about George's biography that people don't already know?
Well, I don't know if there was a new biography published in the fall of '24 about George Massa, A Life Reimagined by Paul Bonesteel and Janet McHugh. And that is the most up-to-date information on George Massa. They're getting ready to launch a website, georgemassa.com, I think it is. But, they actually hired a facial recognition expert because in Japan, his name was Shoji Endo. And nobody really knew that until Janet put her excellent research skills to the task. And they had him identified in these old photographs, and they traveled to Japan and looked at where he had gone to school, and old yearbooks and all sorts of tremendous research. I mean, you just about can't give them enough credit for all of the new information that's out there about George Massa.
Well, when he married, was he married?
Yeah, that was something that was new. George was married when he lived on the West Coast, and there was a scandal, and they were trying to get some money for a Japanese. He was a baseball player out on the West Coast. They were trying to get some money together for the team to go to Japan. And I believe the team made it to Japan, and then there wasn't enough money to get back. And George Massa was, that was not the name he was going by at that point, but he was blamed for the money going missing, and nobody really knows what happened. But anyway, he left the West Coast in disgrace. He was crushed. And all of that is in the new book.
So that's kind of like Horace Kephart, who left St. Louis in disgrace, kind of had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
So those two, I don't know how much they knew about each other. They were good friends. I don't know how much they they talked around the campfire.
I mean, nobody really knows, right? But they did have that in common, that they both left their prior lives behind and they both left in disgrace. And they both found comfort, and they both, in being outdoors and then in being in the mountains. And so they were both kind of reborn in a way by going out in nature and going to the mountains.
Isn't there some kind of effort to find Moss's grave or make it more noticeable?
Well, we know where it is. It's in Riverside Cemetery in Asheville. And it's actually on the trail, because you can go to like Thomas Wolfe and all this.
Oh.
So his grave is there. But you may be thinking of this. He at one point had wanted, there were people that wanted him to be buried beside a campfire. And they never got the money and got it done. So they're not together, but there are people that wanted the two of them together.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wondered if you had ever thought of writing and illustrating your own story.
I write my own stories, but I have no illustration cred. I am not an illustrator, and I told you that Sophie's a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. I mean, that's the kind of people they're looking for to illustrate these books. They are definitely not looking for me.
Is each of your books illustrated by a different artist?
My novels have different cover art by different illustrators, but all of my Storyteller series is illustrated by Sophie Page.
And your storyteller series are picture books?
Yeah, those are the picture books, because my novels aren't illustrated, other than the cover art. But these Saving Granddaddy's stories, She Sang for the Mountains, Story Quilts, and Of Words and Water are all four illustrated by Sophie Page.
And your best, your most famous book today is Ruby Lee and Me, right?
Well, it's the book that has sold.
Other than Of Words and Water.
Yeah, it's the book that has sold the most copies, Ruby Lee and Me, and that's about civil rights in the 1960s. I was actually, when I started elementary school in first grade, it was the first year that our elementary school became integrated. And so our school's first African-American teacher taught me to read. And so Ruby Lee and Me is about that period. And it's also dedicated to my first grade teacher. It says to Mrs. Pauline Porter, who first taught me to read.
Well, I don't think Jim will mind me saying this because he knows I'm shameless in rooting for the home team. But I represent the University of Tennessee Libraries. And the University of Tennessee Press is part of the University Libraries. So if you're ever interested in talking to a publisher about that book that you're working on, that's right up our line. We publish about the Smoky Mountains in the region. We also have experience with illustrators. So.
Well, I've got a book about Ella Costner.
Ella Costner, good old Cock County.
Yeah, I've got a book about Ella Costner I wouldn't mind talking to you about.
Let's stay in touch.
And she's got a heck of a story. And my parents not only knew Ella, but they knew Ella's brother, who was he wasn't a criminal of the Bonnie and Clyde class of fame, but he was in the pen. And Mother blessed him out one day. So anyhow, she didn't know who he was at the time.
But yeah, I've got a manuscript about Ella Costner, poet laureate of the Smokies. So if you'd be interested in taking a
I'll
look
put you
at
in
it.
contact with our director.
Okay.
That would be worth it. I think she was she was a nurse, international nurse.
Yeah, she was a nurse
also
during World War II.
she was also a little bit of a bootlegger, wasn't she?
Well, I left that out. I think it was the brother, but that she was very happy to not turn him in.
I mean, you gotta put the good stuff in there. Good stuff. Anything else? Anybody else? Yeah.
I just wanted, oh, excuse
Go
me.
ahead.
I was just wanting to comment. You talked about your growing up experience in North Carolina and going north. Well, I grew up on a farm doing the same things you did in Michigan. Well, at age 32, my husband and our children, we headed south and ended up in Mills River Valley, which is near Asheville. I knew nothing about that part of the country. So Wilma educated me. I read several of her books and loved every one of them.
It's great.
They really have stood the test of time too, because, I read them as part of my research, and they're still fantastic.
Ms. Oakley.
Yes, so I think it's fascinating hearing all the different aspects of her interest, of her activism, of her writing. Has there been anyone to express an interest in writing a biography of her, looking at those, aspects of her life and the impact and influence that she had?
Over the years, there have been a number of people who have expressed an interest, and the graph. There's the vertical axis and the horizontal axis.
Yeah.
And if you designate the vertical axis as interest, and if you designated the horizontal axis as knowledge of the breadth of Wilma Dykeman's activities, you can just draw a curve going from high at the beginning to low toward the end. Because generally people who express interest are looking at Wilma from one aspect. It could be her environmentalism. And then they say, oh, wait a second. I said, I promised that I would love to write a biography, but then I hear I see that she was critical to civil rights. Oh, and now critical to Appalachian studies. Oh, and now critical to advocacy for birth control. And whoa, forget I said that. Not so interested anymore, because that means their task of understanding is a lot greater. So it's quite interesting. The several biographers have kind of described that curve. It kind of slid along that curve. So it's unbelievable. She does not have a good biography written, and Steve, that's worth going after.
Yeah, that's pressure right there.
We need to find a good PhD student,
We'll find one.
that would want to take that on, that's working with us.
Actually, the closest we've come is a pair of writers. We used to call them the two Elizabeths, and then we called them Thing One and Thing Two. But one of them was Elizabeth Engelhardt, a professor at the University of Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who's done tremendous work, written some great articles on Wilma's work on environmentalism, the early roots of ecofeminism, etc., as well as civil rights and feminism through an Appalachian lens. Teaming up with another Elizabeth Sims, who worked for Tupelo Honey and has done cookbooks and marketing books. So you've got the combination of an academic and a non-academic, and that's what we're looking for. Mother was always skeptical enough of the academy that she knew that that's not all of life. There's a communication piece and a popular general public piece. So anyway, we're still on that path, still looking for it. Shannon, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for having me, and if anybody wants a book, I understand they're for sale.
That's right, we're still out there.